Hello, my friends. This is Father Josh Stevens, rector of St. John in the Wilderness in Flat Rock, North Carolina. And we are beginning a book study on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Discipleship, which is a really fascinating work that Bonhoeffer wrote in the 1930s while leading a seminary in Germany that was dedicated to educating and forming pastors that were to confess Christ in the face of the rise of National Socialism, which was taking over Germany, including the church. So this week we're reading chapter 1, the preface in chapter 1, and chapter 1 is called Costly Grace. I hope you'll consider joining us. We'll be meeting on Thursdays at 9:30 under our 10 of meeting in person, and you can also join us on Wednesday nights online with a session that starts at 7:45. So just a little bit about chapter 1 to give you a taste of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer was all about. The first chapter is called Costly Grace. And Bonhoeffer writes in opening, "Cheap grace is the mortal enemy of our church. Our struggle today is for costly grace. Cheap grace means grace as bargain basement goods, cut rate forgiveness, cut rate comfort, cut rate sacrament. Grace as the church's inexhaustible pantry from which it is doled out by careless hands without hesitation or limit. It is grace without a price, without cost." And he continues, "Cheap grace is that grace which we bestow on ourselves. Cheap grace is preaching forgiveness without repentance. It is baptism without the discipline of community. It is the Lord's Supper without confession of sin. It is absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without the living, incarnate Jesus Christ. Costly grace is the hidden treasure in the field, for the sake of which people go and sell with joy everything they have. It is the costly pearl for whose price the merchant sells all that he has. It is Christ's sovereignty, for the sake of which you tear out an eye if it causes you to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ which causes a disciple to leave his nets and follow him." In closing the chapter out, Bonhoeffer writes directly to the Church of Germany in the 1930s. And he says this to them and perhaps to us also. "In everything that follows, we want to speak up on behalf of those who are tempted to despair, for whom the word of grace has become frightfully empty. For integrity's sake, someone has to speak up for those among us who confess that cheap grace has made them give up following Christ, and that ceasing to follow Christ has made them lose the knowledge of costly grace. Because we cannot deny that we no longer stand in true discipleship to Christ, while being members of a true believing church with a pure doctrine of grace, but no longer members of a church which follows Christ. We therefore simply have to try to understand grace and discipleship again in correct relationship to each other. We can no longer avoid this. Our church's predicament is proving more and more clearly to be a question of how we are to live as Christians today." And so Bonhoeffer invites fellow Christians into this reevaluation of the relationship between grace and discipleship. It's this reevaluation that we hope to jump into ourselves in the weeks ahead as we study this book in conversation with one another. And I hope you've enjoyed just a snippet of it. And I hope you'll either get the book and read along by yourselves, or better yet, to join us on this journey as we look into trying to better understand what it means to receive God's grace and to follow Jesus on the way to the cross.